afternoon, everyone. Huh? You all know me by now. By the way, that exercise that you all got, we're going to get to that later on today, so just hold on to that, okay? So don't lose it. So, as you all know, I recently wrote a book called The Art of Choosing. And in that book, I talk about three big questions that we all struggle with in our life. The first is, why do we want choice? The second is, what are all the things that affect how and what we choose? And the third is, what can we do to improve both our choosing experience and our choice outcomes? Now, today, I'm going to talk about a modern dilemma of choice that we all have. In fact, we all share across the globe at this stage. And it relates to all three questions. Now, this dilemma that I'm talking about has been referred to by lots of different names. I remember one time I was talking to the head of Fidelity Research in Europe, and he described to me this problem. He described to me the studies that first documented this problem. Unbeknownst to him, he was actually describing to me my own studies. And he even gave me slides on the same study. They were actually pretty good slides, so I kept them. And he referred to it as the narrow it down problem. Then there was the time when I met with some folks at McKinsey who described to me, in fact, they even had an internal memo in which they described the very same problem, the very same study, but they called it a different name. They referred to it as the 3x3 rule. Now, my favorite description of this problem was by Rush Limbaugh. He referred to me as the pointy-headed intellectual that didn't know the first thing about the marketplace. Now, I figured I was doing something right if Rush Limbaugh was skewering me. You have probably heard about this problem in one form or another. Most often in the media, it's referred to as the jam problem. So, do you all know what the jam problem is? No? Okay. So do you want to know what the jam problem is? Now, since I'm blind, if your answer is yes, why don't you clap your hands? Thank you. Thank you. All right, well, I was a graduate student at Stanford University in the early 1990s, and I used to go to this upscale grocery store called Draeger's. This was not a normal grocery store. It used to offer you lots and lots of variety. It was almost like going to an amusement park. It had like 250 different kinds of mustards and vinegars and mayonnaises and over 500 different kinds of fruits and vegetables, over a dozen different kinds of bottled water. And, this is in an era where we actually used to drink tap water. Here's their olive oil aisle. They had 75 different kinds of olive oils, including those that were in a locked case that came from apparently 1,000-year-old trees. Well, I used to go to this store regularly, in fact, and then one day I asked myself, gosh, Sheena, why come you never buy anything? Of course, I was a poor graduate student. Well, I decided to go pay a visit to the manager. And I asked him whether this model of offering people lots and lots of choice was really working. And he said, well, obviously it's working. Haven't you seen the busloads of tourists that show up every day? They were usually like taking cameras and taking pictures. So we decided to do a little experiment. We did an experiment with jam. Now here's the jam aisle. They had 348 different kinds of jam. So we picked Wilkin & Sons jam, the Queen of England's jam, to do our little experiment. So we set up a tasting booth right near the entrance of the store, in which we either set out 6 different flavors of jam, or we put out 24 different flavors of jam. And we didn't have the normal flavors like strawberry or orange marmalade. We had things like lemon curd and little scarlet and Victoria plum. So we looked at 2 things. First, in which case were more people likely to be attracted to our jam booth? Sample some jam. And you could sample as many as you wanted. More people stopped when there were 24, 60%, than when there were 6, 40%. Now we looked at buying behavior, and now we see the opposite effect. Of the people who stopped when they were 24, only 3% of them actually bought a jar of jam. Of the people who stopped when they were 6, 30% of them actually bought a jar of jam. Now, if you actually do the math, people were at least 6 times more likely to buy a jar of jam if they had encountered 6 than if they had encountered 24. Now, this isn't a jam problem. This is actually a choice overload problem. And that study was first published in the year 2000, and since then, over a decade has gone by, and there's been dozens upon dozens of studies that have documented this phenomenon that is referred to as the choice overload problem. And we've looked at people making all different kinds of decisions. These studies have been done by myself, by my colleagues at other institutions. And we look at decisions like buying a chocolate, picking who to go out on a date with, which job offer to accept, how to invest for your future, for your financial future, healthcare decisions, all different kinds of decisions. And essentially we notice 3 negative consequences associated with giving people more rather than fewer choices. First, the more choices people have, the less likely they are to engage, to make a choice. The more likely they are to procrastinate, choose not to choose, and they will choose not to choose even when it goes against their best interests. So we're not just talking about, protecting your waistlines by not choosing jam. People actually will choose not to choose even when that goes against their best interests. Second, the more choices people have, the worse choices they'll make. So they'll make worse financial choices, for example. Third, the more choices people have, the more likely they are to be dissatisfied by what they chose, even if they do objectively better. Now, why is this? Well, we've always known that our eyes are too big for our stomachs. Our grandmothers told us that over and over again. But our eyes are too big for our minds as well. So we might enjoy staring at these big aisles filled with mustards, vinegars, jams, etc., but we can't actually do the math of comparing and contrasting and picking from that stunning display. In 1956, there was a famous study that was conducted by a man named George Miller. He was a famous psychologist at Harvard University. And he came out with this seminal paper referred to as the magical number 7 plus or minus 2. And in this paper, he documented 2 limitations of our minds, which are still true even today. First, if I ask you to rate a bunch of things from best to worst, smells, tastes, things to look at, beyond about 7, things you thought you liked better, you get confused and think you like it less well, and vice versa. The second thing that was observed was that if I ask you to keep track of a bunch of information in your mind, words, numbers, pictures, I don't give you any opportunity to memorize it or rehearse it. Well, beyond about 7, the information just starts to crumble away. Well, what is a choice but a bundle of information? What are you doing when you're making a choice? You're comparing bundles upon bundles upon bundles of information. This is a very tough exercise that we give ourselves. Now, let's think about all the choices we make today and have today. We can choose our careers. We can choose our spouses. We can choose where we want to live. We can choose how we want to live. We can choose how we want to schedule our entertainment. We can choose which one of 100 different kinds of jams we want to spread across our toast. We can choose more than that, different flavors and brands of soda pop we want to have with our meal. In 1949, the typical grocery store offered you 3,700 products. Today, the typical grocery store offers 45,000 products. The typical Walmart offers you 100,000 products. If you go online, you get 1 million products. Amazon.com offers you 27 million books to choose from. And if you're lonely, you just go on Match.com and there are 15 million date possibilities. So we want more choice, because the more choices we have, the more likely we are to find the, quote, perfect match. But the more choices we have, the harder it becomes for us to actually know what we want, find what we want, and actually choose in line with our preferences. So what do we do about this? Do we give people what they say they want? Well, people say they want a lot of choice, but it's not actually clear they want a lot of choice. What they want is to feel that the choice that they have made is the, quote, right choice. A choice that they can feel confident of will serve their needs. A choice that while making they felt competent about knowing what their preferences were and knowing that they chose in line with their preferences. We can accomplish those goals not by necessarily expanding the choice set. We can accomplish those goals by improving the choosing experience. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to describe to you four of a bunch of different techniques that we've been studying in my laboratories. I'm going to describe four techniques that I think one or more of these will be hopefully useful to you as you go back and think about how to manage choice, you being the choice providers. So, Paul this morning talked to you about 3 C's. Well, I'm going to add to those 3 C's by offering you 4 C's. So the first technique is cut. You've heard it said before in lots of different venues, but I don't think it's ever been more true than today that less is more. Cut. Cut the alternatives which are distracting. Cut the alternatives which are redundant. So often when I speak to people, they're nervous about cutting. My God, you want me to cut? But if I cut, I'll lose some of my market share. Well, there is increasing amount of evidence that documents now that if you are willing to cut, you can actually see increases. So in the business environment, we see things like an increase in sales, a lowering of costs, an improvement in choosing experience, which amounts to greater trust. So for example, when Procter & Gamble went from offering 26 different varieties of Head & Shoulders down to 15, they saw an increase in sales by 10%. When the Golden Cat Corporation removed their 10 worst selling cat litter products, they saw an overall increase in revenues by 87%. Came from a lowering of costs and an increase of sales. I just told you a few minutes ago that the typical grocery store offers you 45,000 products. But the 9th largest retailer today in the world is Aldi's. It's a grocery store. It only offers you 1,400 products. And it's growing. That's even less than the number of choices we had in 1949. How do you know what to cut? The way I do it when I'm working with an organization is I always go and talk to the employees, the people that are actually on the ground. And I ask them a very simple question. Tell me how these options differ from one another. If they can't tell me how those options differ, your customers, whoever it is that you're trying to talk to, can't tell them apart either. That's your first clue as to which ones to cut, which ones look redundant. Now let's say they really aren't redundant. You just haven't done a very good job of distinguishing them. Well, now that brings me to technique number 2, which is categorize. There are going to be times when you have to offer people more than the handful of options. There's just no choice about that. But how can we offer people more choices in a way that still enables them to understand and take advantage of the choices that you're offering them? By categorization. We did a study, I'm going to give you one example, with Wegmans grocery stores in the magazine aisles up and down the Northeast corridor in the United States. Now, the magazine aisles in Wegmans they all look identical, but the number of magazines they stock vary anywhere from 331 to 664. And we observed the customers, we interviewed the customers, we observed purchasing behavior. And what we found was that customers have absolutely no idea how many choices you're offering them. I mean, the correlation between how many choices they think you're offering them and how many you are actually offering them is close to zero. What actually drives their perception of how much variety you're offering them, whether they like the choosing experience and what you have on offer, didn't have to do with how many options you offered them. It had to do with how those options were categorized. So if I give you 300 choices and I categorize them into 20 categories versus I give you 600 choices and I categorize them into 10, the one who sees the 600 with 10 perceives themselves as having less choice. It's the one who sees more categories who perceives greater variety. Why? Well, that's because our minds can handle many, many more categories. We can handle up to about 20 to 25 categories because categories are cues. Categories are the way we know, okay, this is going to tell me how my choices are different from one another. Per category, I can now handle about a handful of choices, maybe up to 10, depending upon how simple or complicated those options are that comprise that category. Now, let me show you these two selections of jewelry. They've been categorized. One is called jazz, the other one is called swing. Okay? If you think the collection on the left is swing, and the collection on the right is jazz, clap your hands. Okay, I'm getting some claps. Okay, now what about the other way around? The collection on the left is jazz and the collection on the right is swing? Okay, a little more. So people are more likely to think jazz on the left and swing on the right, but not everybody was convinced of that, right? By the way, jazz is on the left, right? But that's a horrible, absolutely unhelpful categorization scheme. I mean, if you've got your audience wondering, I mean, you've got a problem, right? So when making those categorizations, those names, you don't think about it from the perspective of the choice maker, but from the perspective of the chooser. And I would say, you know, in terms of charities, one of my sort of informal observations, there's an awful lot of charities out there. And a lot of times I can't tell them apart. Sometimes their names are so similar, I don't even know what they're about. That makes it tough. Well, you guys have had a very long day, and you've been enormously patient. And I feel that the organizers ought to offer you a free trip. That's one of the things they should raffle off. A free trip to the most beautiful place in the world. Okay, so here's a description of the most beautiful place in the world that you could go on a drive. Imagine that the organizers here were to give you an all-expenses-paid trip. Okay? How many of you are ready to take them up on their offer? Clap your hands. Okay? All right, maybe that's about, what, half of you maybe? All right. Now let me show you something else. Now who wants to go on this trip? Okay, a little bit less, but there's still some, you know, brave souls out there. Okay? Brings me to the third technique, concretization. So many of the choices we're given today, we're given them in a very abstract way. So we're told all the information we need to know about this drive in writing. In fact, in some ways, you could argue you're given more information in written form than those pictures actually gave you. But it didn't feel the same until you saw those pictures. Right? It just felt different. Right? Because once you saw the pictures, you understood the consequences of that choice. Right? And that's very important. People have to understand not just the objective characteristics of a choice, but they have to be able to feel the trade-offs, the consequences associated with any given choice confronting them. There's a reason why we spend an average of 15 to 30% more on our credit cards and on our ATM cards than when we spend using pure cash. It just doesn't feel real when you just put this card out there. Similarly, when you look at charitable giving, it sounds powerful when you tell people, look, 1 out of 5 kids are starving. I get that. That seems important. But you know what? In order to get me to give, you need to do more than tell me that. You need to show me that picture. You need to give me that story. I need to feel that statistic. Here's my 4th C, condition. There are a lot of very complicated choices we make today. And in some sense, those are some great opportunities that we get. We now have the opportunity to have choices that are completely custom made for ourselves. And given that we have that opportunity, we ought to be able to take advantage of that. But how do we take advantage of that without becoming a victim of choice overload? You ever go to a deli and try ordering a sandwich? You know, like, what kind of bread do you want? Okay, you go through 10 different kinds of bread. What kind of meat? Okay, and then, you know, whether it's organic. I mean, forget about the flavors. You have to first decide whether it's got to be organic or not. Then you get to the flavors. Then you get to the spicing of the meat. Then you got the cheeses. Then you got each and every kind of salad. Then you've got the condiments. Somewhere in the middle, you're like, okay, get me out of here. I don't want a sandwich. So how do you make these kinds of difficult choices easier for people to cope with? So I'm going to show you a study I did with a famous German car manufacturer that doesn't want to be named, picking cars, because it's a very complicated decision. So people in Europe get to completely custom make their choice, their car. They make about 60 different decisions. And these decisions vary in the number of options that they're offered. So you could go from anywhere from 4 gear shifts to 4 engines to 13 different kinds of rear view mirrors, all the way up to 56 different kinds of car colors. Okay, so it very much varies, and you've got to make all these decisions. Well, what this car company agreed to do was vary the order in which these decisions appeared. So the customers have all decided to buy this particular car, and they now have to make 60 decisions. And now they're on the computer screen making these decisions, and we've varied the order in which these decisions appear. So in half the cases, they go from high, 56 different car colors, gradually gets, less and less and less choice, all the way down to 4 gear shifts. The other half goes from low, 4 gear shifts, gradually gets more and more and more choice, all the way up to 56 different car colors. Now we look at 2 things. First, in which case are people more likely to sort of hit the default? I'm tired, I'm just going to hit the default. We figured if you keep hitting the default, that must mean you're getting pretty disengaged. And what we find is the people that go from high to low are hitting that default much, much more frequently than the people that go from low to high. Note, everybody is making the same set of decisions. I haven't technically made it easier on you. All I did was vary the order in which the decisions appeared. Second, I asked them how satisfied are they? How likely are they to buy another car from this company, more relevantly, right? Again, high to low, less satisfied. Low to high, more satisfied. We can handle complexity provided you ease me in. Let me first stick a little part of my toe, and then gradually stick my foot in, and then gradually my leg, and so on and so forth. We can handle complexity provided you take me in little by little by little. Because what's happening if I go in little by little, I'm learning how to choose. I'm learning how to figure out what my preferences are. And that helps me as the choice set gets more and more complicated. Remember I pointed out the McKinsey 3x3 rule? Often, when you look at brokers, when you look at management consultants, when you look at high-end jewelry retailers, anytime you're offering a complicated decision, particularly when it's a one-on-one client-based relationship, what you see as being one of the most effective strategies is what we colloquially refer to as the 3x3 rule. I will give you 3 tiers of 3 choices. It helps you figure out how to think about the choices, helps you figure out what your preferences are, which now makes it easier for you to figure out what choice do you want to make. And I would say in your sector, this is an important heuristic to keep in mind. Because people probably don't know what they want to give to, how much they want to give, and what their preferences really are on this domain. All right, well, so these are some, let me just review these 4 techniques for what are some techniques we can use as choice providers. Cut, categorize, concretize, condition. These are helpful techniques that you can use as choice providers. But as you all know, you guys are also the leaders. People will look to you for advice, not just on how to provide choices, but they will look to you as the role models as choosers. So you could use these same 4 principles on yourselves to make your own choosing lives easier. Did you know that the typical CEO today engages in an average of 139 tasks a week? And each of these tasks are made up of many, many, many sub-choices. By the way, you guys are probably making more choices. You don't have as much staff. Right? Now, if you now further look at the CEO's decision life, about 50% of those decisions are made in 9 minutes or less. Only about 11% are given an hour or more of their time. Have you thought about how many decisions you make? How do you decide which ones go into the 9-minute category versus the 1 hour category? Are the ones that are making it into the 1 hour category, are those the ones that are the most important? So I've given you an exercise, and people have repeatedly told me this is probably the most important thing I've ever done for them, the best thing for them in their lives. And I want to get you guys to commit to doing this exercise in the next 48 hours. So anybody here who's willing to commit, I'd like you to clap your hands. So here's what you do, and it's there on your label as well. If you remember nothing else of what I've said today, just remember this exercise, and remember to do it. First, jot down all the tasks that you do in a typical week and make that list as long as you'd like. Then go through that list and cross out everything that's redundant, that's extraneous, that's distractions. You should be able to cut out at least 50%. Then go through that list and ask yourself, where is the frustration higher? The frustration I get if I complete this task is going to be higher than the reward I get if I complete this task. Where the frustration is higher, they either get cut. If you can't cut them, they go in the 9-minute category. Those are the decisions where you're simply looking for don't fail, don't get it wrong, don't do a disaster. Come up with heuristics. The ones that will make it, which become candidates for your 1 hour category, are the ones where the reward is greater than the potential frustration. Now you carry that list down. Now you try to categorize that. Categorize that. Once you've looked at the categories, now you say, okay, of these categories, in which of these am I the most suited to do it? Which of these should I be doing versus delegating them out? How do I decide if I should be doing it? Where is my value added greatest? What am I the best at? Where can I contribute the most to my organization? The rest, delegate out. Now, through the series of winnowing down, you will come up with your 3 priorities, right? I mean, that's usually my rule of thumb, 3. Some people might say it should be 1. Some people might say it should be 5. Certainly don't make it more than 5. You'll be spread too thin. Those are the things that you are going to focus on. Those are the things that you want to do absolutely the very best at. To get the most from choice, one needs to be choosy about choosing. And each of us ought to ask ourselves which choices in our lives are distracting us from our larger goals. Which choices are actually worth making? Which choices should we actually let go? And if we keep these things in mind, we'll be on our way to practicing the art of choosing. Thank you very much.